Good morning, Cubaneros. The Loina sisters represented the social history of old Cuba, the material and spiritual essence of its ruling class, and its place in Western First World civilization. As the daughters of a general in the Cuban War of Independence, they also had impeccable liberal and patriotic credentials. Maria de las Mercedes Loinas, known all her life as Dulce Maria, was Cuba's most esteemed woman poet, the only woman to win the Premio Cervantes Prize, the Nobel Prize of Hispanic Literature. From her mansion in the once elite suburb of El Vedado at 19th and E Streets, she and her family ruled the cultural world of Havana and Cuba. Her sister, Flor Loinas, took an active part in the semi-revolution of 1933, joined the university student directorate, and used her 1930 Fiat in street demonstrations, being forced to hide its bullet-riddled chassis in the family garage. Dulce Maria Loinez's husband was Pablo Alvarez de Cañas, a self-made Spanish immigrant entrepreneur who symbolized the social striving of bourgeois Cuba. Through his connections to the dictator Machado's political machine, he became the society page editor of the Havana newspaper El País. Anybody who was part of the elite, or wanted to be, craved mention in the society pages of El País. Thanks to this, he married into the patrician Loinaz family, and Pablo became the chief promoter of Cuban tobacco in the U.S., a legacy that endures today with the possessing classes of North America and indeed the whole First World. Well, in 1959 there occurred a little thing called the Cuban Revolution. A movement declaring itself of the humble, for the humble, and by the humble obviously had little long-term place for either Dulce or Flor Loinaz, Pablo Alvarez de Cañas, and the civilization they so graciously represented. With those he had always taken for granted now in power, Pablo fled Cuba, while the two sisters stayed behind, secluded in their gracious estates, as the world outside their walls and wrought iron gates changed fundamentally around them. Dulce's house in Vedado remained a living museum of gracious patrician culture in the capital of Marxist-Leninist Cuba well into the 1990s, while Flor remained in her mansion at the city's western outskirts in La Coronela, with a collection of 30 dogs keeping her company on the premises, with her 1930 Fiat still in the garage and now much too expensive to keep running. The fate of Dulce, Pablo, and Flor represent the fate of first world elite swamped by the rise of the third world, not in some distant global contest, but right in their own backyard. But they do also symbolize the fate of the Western elite, its culture, values, and civilization, its wealth and power, as the nobodies laid claim to the world they knew. The fate of the elite of old Havana is the destiny of the first world's elite, as the former third world, those nations and peoples always taken for granted to keep their places, rise to dominate the planet. Those elites had a foreboding sense of this from the beginning, which is why they reacted so viscerally to the Cuban Revolution and the great hope it unleashed in Latin America and around the world, and still try to strangle its example. Not wanting to see themselves turned into dog ladies of Havana, reduced to museum piece relics in genteel poverty behind their gates, they continued to compulsively lash out not only at Cuba but at the social revolution of beggars outside those gates. This likely explains the desperation of those mad bombers Johnson, Nixon, and Kissinger in Indochina, or the unleashing of terrorists like General Pinochet in Chile and throughout Latin America, and on and on. Because what Cuba did was to raise up its internal third world by redistributing its first world wealth, using second world means. In this way, it didn't really matter how much of a Marxist Fidel Castro was, or was not, when he swept into power as El Leader Maximo in 1959, but the structural context of the nation he came to rule. Cuba was a corporate colony of North America, but it was also an internal colony of the city of Havana, as rural and eastern Cuba was subordinated by the port of Havana and its links to the capitalist world system. This was recognized long before the first Marxist ever turned out of Havana University. What the revolution aimed to do was break the feudalism of its sugar and cattle export regime in black eastern Cuba, and the colonialism of Havana and white western Cuba over the east and all of rural Cuba, and finally the colonial relationship of all of Cuba to Washington and Wall Street. Realistically, this cannot be done within the confines of the Western political and economic system then ruling the country. This, of necessity, led to a radical break with that system if the revolution was to be more than just another third world comic opera, if Castro was to be more than just a Barack Obama. Given Cuba's closeness to the U.S., geographically as much as economic or political, and the context of the Cold War, and its own lack of energy resources, it's not surprising that this search for new forms and context and market alliances and defense needs against a murderous enemy went to extreme lengths, including the edge of hot war. Cuba had changed its gender after 1959 and was no longer the glittering harlot of the Caribbean for the North American elite. Hence the Latin culture symbols of guerrilla fatigues and beards, macho warriors, guns in hand, extending to the charged symbolism of nuclear missiles in achieving parity with the big dogs of the North, their own worst nightmare in avoiding the reversal of fate of Flor Loinaz, the dog lady of Havana. Well, it's a half-century since La Revolución Cubana put the fear of God into the materialists of Wall Street, but the lesson is not lost. Even if their mission is eventually successful, that they break and overturn the Cuban Revolution, they can't reverse its legacy nor what it represents. That they are no longer the world's ruling class, enjoying all it has to offer at their fingertips at the snap of said fingers. That they will, sooner or later, join the Loina sisters and Pablo as the former Third World comes to power around the world and in their own backyard. Fear of this is why they continue to lash out, 50 years after the Bay of Pigs and the Gulf of Tonkin, why we're witnessing unending wars in the Middle East and are poised to enter new ones in Syria and Iran. That also explains the perpetual hysteria of Israel, that Middle Eastern Havana poised on the brink of Third World colonialism. Should the dam break and Los Humildes of the West Bank and Gaza seize power, the Cubans of Miami better move over to make room. As Mike Davis, author of Planet of Slums, states, 50% of the world's population now live in urban Third World conditions, and more than that if we tack on the peasant populations remaining in Asia. The desperation of the Western elite to maintain its 1% privileges on a 99% planet will continue, but it's doomed to eventual fail, as the Third World no longer keeps its place. India and China and Brazil are examples of the rising humble now crashing the gates of the Western elite. That they are doing so through the global market system is hardly in favor of the West, because only when China and India threw off their subjection to Western colonialism and corporatism did they achieve the sovereignty necessary to become equal players, to match the big running dogs. And Brazil is booming thanks to its socialist labor leader, Lula da Silva. Even within the West's own rules, the rise of the humble is a threat to the long-term interests of the DuPonts and the Rockefellers and the Hedges who used to rule Cuba from the resort estates outside Havana. Even Cuba now wants to follow the Chinese road, and this is possible once again only because the revolution reclaimed its sovereignty to become master of its own house, which it has even under the Castro brothers, much more than it ever did under its old cultural mistresses. So, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War has brought no peace dividend, but new urgency to lash out against the rising tide of undermen, as Boston aristocrat T. Lothrop Stoddard used to write in the days of the Great Gatsby, before going on to propagandize for Adolf Hitler. And when our planet is finally a poisoned, polluted, incinerated, and uninhabitable husk, they can take pride in knowing its culture and spirit has been preserved from the fate of the Dog Lady of Havana. Uh-oh. Phone knock this early? Hello? Who? Salvador Allende? The former Democratic Marxist president of Chile, murdered by Henry Kissinger's hitman Augusto Pinochet? You just want to add that it wouldn't have mattered how democratic Fidel was, they'd have tried to overthrow him anyway? And that your fate is what you get for playing by your enemy's rules of democracy and the rule of law. Washington and Wall Street will dump those in the trash as quickly as Fidel ever did when it's fighting time over who owns the doggy dish.